Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Legard, and together with Mark Gallagher, we're At The Controls, the podcast that takes inspiration from Formula One, the people, the cars, the technology, and the positive philosophy that underpins the sport. And this month, we're taking our inspiration from two Formula One champions, Niki Lauda and Mika Hakkinen. We're going to be talking about the late, great Niki Lauda ahead of the launch of a new biography of the great man. And we're going to hear from Mika Hakkinen like you've never heard him talk before. Seriously. But we'll start with the big story, that Sebastian Vettel is leaving Ferrari at the end of the year. Mark, were you really expecting this news from Ferrari and Vettel?
It seems extraordinary that their negotiations have broken down. So from that perspective, really, I think it has come as a shock to everyone just to see an end to that long-standing and ultimately unfruitful relationship in terms of winning world championships. So the question now, of course, everyone's speculating about what's going to happen next. We're not going to try and do too much of that. We'll leave it to others.
Well, we've been talking to someone who knows Sebastian very well, former Red Bull and McLaren driver David Coulthard, 13 times a race winner, still very much a leading Formula One personality, who told us when we spoke to him that he wasn't completely surprised at the announcement.
Well, without wanting to appear clever and having a finger on a pulse, which I frankly don't have any inside knowledge as to the negotiations. But when the announcement that Charles Leclerc had been signed in a multi-year deal, to me that clearly suggested that the team were prepared to put a bit of pressure on the negotiation with Sebastian, because right now he isn't on a crest of a wave. It's not like Lewis Hamilton, who, as we descended into COVID-19 scenarios and delays in Grand Prix seasons, you start to wonder whether Lewis has outmaneuvered himself in a negotiation because of lack of leverage. But in actual fact, what this does is bring him back into play. But I think the writing's been on the wall since the early announcement of Charles and Max to their respective teams that he was going to have to sharpen his pencil on the contract terms, because if we remind ourselves, he left a Red Bull contract early because there was a clause that allowed him to do so. And that triggered Alonso having to leave Ferrari and him going off to McLaren. So, what worked for you once upon a time sometimes doesn't work for you in another stage of your career.
Now, tell me this, DC, looking back at your own experience, your 9 years at McLaren came to an end. When that moment arises, when it arrives, when you realise that the team you've been with for ever such a long time and have achieved quite a lot of success with, that you and they are parting company, presuming you're not wanting to retire, what then goes through your mind in terms of what comes next?
Well, if I look at that specific scenario, it was at the French Grand Prix 2003 that Ron Dennis and Martin Whitmarsh took me in to one of their offices and explained that they'd signed Montoya and that I wouldn't be required after the end of the 2004 season. So I knew a season and a half prior to leaving the team, and they did that out of respect for the fact I'd been there for 7 seasons already, and they knew that inevitably his management would at some point leak it out. They actually managed to keep it under wraps until I think November of that year. So what it does do is you sort of knuckle down with, okay, I'm going to show the team that this isn't a good decision they've made, and you obviously gives you a brief focus, if you like, on the job in hand, because inevitably over a period of time we all take various situations and scenarios for granted. So it's sometimes important to be reminded that we're all replaceable, and Sebastian now has realised that in that particular negotiation. Whether he's decided to walk away or whether they've said we're now concluding this negotiation, he now knows he's got a season of racing, however many races that will be, assuming we do go racing, to then decide what his future is.
And in terms of recalibrating your mindset to potentially go to, let's face it, a lower team. When you left McLaren, I remember you've explained to me before, DC, you literally go through all the options, don't you? And recalibrate your mindset as to what the possibilities are for the future.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting, I think, for Sebastian. In my case, and one thing that's always sort of stood out in my mind, and I say this as someone who knows Sebastian from his early days with Red Bull, with Toro Rosso, and I feel a little bit like a politician by starting by saying, like, I really like and respect Sebastian. But that said, I think it's important to have people around you that don't always say, yes or no, sir. They will call you out, they will question. In my case, you both know Martin Brundle, and Martin was my contractual manager. And when I was getting it wrong, he would at the appropriate moment say, I think you got that wrong. And, I didn't like it, of course not, because you're sort of having your nose rubbed in it. But it's the tough love that you get with families, with our kids. We tell them things and it's upsetting for them at times, and we don't feel good about that, but we're preparing them for the real life scenarios. So I just wonder whether in Seb's case, with the structure he has with a lawyer and his team around him, whether there's anyone been there giving it, mate, the iceberg's coming or the road roller's coming. Prepare yourself for what the scenarios are coming up.
So if he was to ring you for advice, and as you say, you've known him a long time, what sort of thoughts could you give to him? How will he handle this, and how he should consider what's ahead of him?
Well, the performance of the car is absolutely key. And, that was something that after I signed to McLaren for 96, and I went from leading for Williams Adelaide 95 to being 13th on the grid in Melbourne a few months later, I then crystallized in my mind I would never ever make a decision based on the other terms of the contract. It was to try and use my best crystal ball to what car is going to give me the best chance of winning races. So that's where I would start. The how many days he's expected to work and what the payments are and all that sort of thing. At this stage of his career is it's nice and it's what defines a professional. And for many, it becomes a gauge as to their worth, that they want to believe that they're one of the top 2 or 3 earners. But quite frankly, right now, which car is going to give him a chance to win Grand Prix and, more importantly, in his case, a championship? So, is that going to be crystal ball? Is that going to be Renault crystal ball? Is that going to be McLaren? Is there any route back to Red Bull? You have to open those conversations. And I actually think, given the sort of 24-month or shorter now view, it's quite difficult to see who is, other than those top 3 teams, Ferrari, Red Bull, and Mercedes, of course, have got a clear route to giving him a championship car. Renault may well get a winning car, but will they, in that period of time, will they really truly develop a world championship car? And likewise, McLaren.
Here's a thought. Can he win again? Because so many people are doubting that he can win again. That we've seen the best and he's over the hill.
He can win again. He is a quality driver. He's a 4-time world champion. He has got, we've been hailing the arrival of Charles Leclerc at Ferrari and his great speed. And he certainly had that wonderful honeymoon year at Ferrari, but it wasn't like he consistently blew the doors off of Sebastian. And it's 2 drivers at 2 different phases of the career. Sebastian's overriding thought was, how do I make this a world championship car? And Charles's overriding thought was, how do I out-qualify Sebastian, and how do I, get my first race victory? It's different pressures, different phases of their lives. And as sure as we're having this conversation, Charles will have some difficult periods ahead, because he won't always be the darling of Ferrari, and he won't always be forgiven for his honesty when he makes a mistake, in the same way we don't forgive Sebastian as a 4-time champion for making some of the mistakes he's made. I do recall the great Senna and Alain Prost and Nigel Mansell making mistakes as world champions, but somehow the passing of time, they were a bit more, we were more accepting of that.
DC, would you like to see Sebastian Vettel continue in Formula One?
If Sebastian Vettel can perform at his top performance, yeah, unquestionably, he's been a big part of the modern era. If his mind is distracted, if his heart's not in it, and I can't possibly know whether any of those things are the case, then only he will know. And I remember having a conversation with Mark Webber in Montreal, where when he was still racing, and he asked me, how do you know when it's time to stop? And I explained how it came about in my sense, where when I drove a car in winter testing for the first time in my career, I just suddenly felt I'd run out of energy, I'd run out of desire, I'd run out of that hunger to sit with the engineers scratching their heads until late into the night, day after day after day. And when I finished the conversation, I went away, and in my mind, I was absolutely sure Mark was retiring from Formula One. Because the minute you're asking the question, you're already starting to doubt. So by the end of the year, he'd retired from Formula One, and he'd signed to go sports car racing.
But you would believe that Seb wants to continue, wouldn't you? He's only 32 years old. He's not in his mid-30s or even later like Nigel Mansell and you or even Mark Webber.
Yeah, but he started earlier. So I think that these guys arrive in Formula One better prepared at a younger age, but they mentally burn out. I don't think they run out of the speed. I think they run out of the need. And that's why I think that Lewis Hamilton is really one of the truly exceptional drivers, because he's somehow managed to find a scenario and a lifestyle that allows him to come back. And yes, he's had a great car, unquestionably, but he's been a catalyst there as well. And, Seb has had a pretty good car at Ferrari. But let's be frank about it, in the same way that, Michael had a family and other things away from Grand Prix racing. Seb has, 2-3 children. Distractions are good as long as they're positive. But with the greatest respect to the love we all have for our families, we can all attest to the fact that, having a family is not always, Polaroid pictures and giggles and laughs. Sometimes it's tough and sometimes it's tiring. And, if you've got two drivers, one arriving, absolutely full of energy, ready to go and attack the racetrack, and the other one giving it, oh, God, thank God I'll get a good night's sleep tonight because I don't have the kids here, then it has to make a difference.
That final answer, Mark, from David, suggested that he wouldn't be surprised if Sebastian Vettel stopped altogether because he's been in the sport so long. Can you see that yourself?
Yeah, it's going to be a really interesting dynamic. Now that the decision is made, of course, you can imagine Sebastian and his family and his associates just wondering, what do we do next? And perhaps coming to the conclusion, actually, this is the right time to stop. He'll have to rethink his entire approach to Formula One if he's going to continue, because he's not going to be driving for a race-winning or a World Championship-winning team in all likelihood. And the question is whether he can adjust his horizons accordingly.
But you know what it's like. I mean, you've been in all sorts of Formula One teams. You've been a team owner yourself, not necessarily in Formula One. You were MD at Cosworth. You know all the ins and outs of signing a driver, the benefits, the disadvantages. We heard from David Coulthard in our first podcast about he made himself almost invaluable to sponsors by being so good with them and how to explain the ins and outs of Formula One. In terms of what Sebastian Vettel needs to be considering and in terms of what teams will be considering, give us a balance sheet, if you can, as to what's going to be on their minds, as to how they evaluate what he can bring to the team age 32.
Well, there will be plenty of teams prepared to consider someone of Sebastian Vettel's talent and experience, not only because of what he can still achieve on track, but also in the commercial benefits that having a 4 times world champion can bring to a team's profile and in its appeal to sponsors. A team like Williams, for example, could view him as an ideal candidate to help pull them off the back of the grid, while Renault, if they're still around once the coronavirus has finished decimating the car industry, might see Sebastian as someone who can unlock the door to success, which they so desperately need.
He'll be bearing in mind, I'm sure, that old adage, you're a long time retired. You've got to make sure in your own mind that you're ready to stop. His great hero, Michael Schumacher, clearly wasn't in 2006 at Ferrari. And we can look in all sorts of sports, Formula One, boxing. We're going to talk about someone as well who retired and then came back, Niki Lauda. You need to work out in your own mind what it is that you want and still go for it. So we're going to watch developments on that Sebastian Vettel story. Not many drivers, of course, leave Ferrari and still prosper, except, of course, if your name's Niki Lauda, who, of course, won his 3rd title with McLaren. So lots to talk about with the author of a new Niki Lauda biography, Maurice Hamilton, well-respected Formula One writer for many years, and the TV presenter, Lee McKenzie. And Mark and I chatted to them before the Vettel news broke.
It's lovely to be virtually chatting to everyone. It feels like the little coffee breaks we used to take in the Formula One paddock, although now we're speaking from our own homes.
And where are you?
I'm up in Scotland. I came to Scotland the day that lockdown was announced, and I'm very fortunate. I live about a 2-minute walk to the beach, and I'm surrounded by golf courses which aren't in use, so I've been able to hijack them and use them for walks. But it's easy sometimes to forget until you turn the news on that there's this devastation going on all around you. So it's just trying to make the best of what is a desperate situation for people.
Maurice, you're probably just coming out of lockdown, aren't you? Having been writing so many books, this is all quite familiar to you.
Yeah, actually, yes, Jonathan. There's been very little change for me, I'm pleased to say, insofar as I was planning to go to the Dutch Grand Prix. Obviously, that didn't happen. But otherwise, life has been pretty much as normal for me because I've been finishing various projects which I'd be working from home with anyway. It's funny the way these things work out. With the lockdown and no racing, magazines and websites have had nothing current to write about for obvious reasons. And they've been saying to me, for example, over Easter, were you at Donington Park when Ayrton Senna had that great race? Yes, I was. Oh, could you write about it? Yes, I can. I've got my archives here. And I've never been busier. I'm trying to slow down. It's not working.
How soon do you think we're going to be racing, Maurice? I mean, you're talking there about Zandvoort. You wanted to go there. They're still making improvements and making tweaks and changes. We should have been going there, but we're not. But there's all this talk that we're going to go to Austria, as I said at the start. Do you think Formula One will be there, really?
I have to say I don't think so, Jonathan. Sadly. And I'm not being overly pessimistic here, but there's just so many things to sort out in the running of a Grand Prix, even if it is behind closed doors, for all the reasons we know, the personnel involved, the marshalling, the medical backup, all of those things. I would say that we'll probably get to Monza in September, to be realistic. They might slot a few into that, what was a gap in August, the summer break we were supposed to have. But let's say they do start at Monza in September. They've still, by my reckoning, got 6, 7, 8, 9, about another 10. They could get 10 races in, and that would provide a championship. All right, it's not the 22, but it's 10 races. It's a championship with points going for every race. And I think we'll have to be satisfied. In fact, we should be satisfied with that because a lot of sports, other than motorsport, are not as well off as we are in that respect.
I think Austria was always going to try and go for it because Dietrich Mateschitz at Red Bull pays for the race. He has very close relationships with the Austrian government. The Austrians are always going to basically try and create an isolated event where they could, just crack on with it. The difficulty is you've got to get teams travelling from Switzerland, travelling from Italy, of course, travelling from the heartlands of Formula One here in the UK. And there are just so many questions. And my final point on all of this is it requires all of the people who are asked to go to be happy to go. And there are employees of these teams who are, of course, massively keen to go Formula One racing. But not everyone is going to want to jump on a plane, even if it has been chartered, and go to a foreign country. So I would be very much along the lines of Maurice's view that you can still have a championship with 10 races if you can't have the 15 to 18 that Chase Carey is desperately trying to have in order to save the financial security of Formula One. But if it ended up being a nice, clean 10-race championship, so be it. And the belt tightening in Formula One will simply have to continue.
So there's a question for you, Lee. If someone said, right, Lee, this is what we're doing. We're starting in Austria in July. There's your ticket. Come and join us. Are you going, yeah, I'll be there, no worries? Or are you thinking, do you know what? I think it's a bit too quick myself.
I mean, I suppose I can do exactly what drivers do and hide behind the thing as I do what the team tells me to do. So if Channel 4 tell me to go, I'd be surprised if they did. I wouldn't be at all surprised if broadcasters aren't allowed anyway and you have to come from a studio to begin with. But Maurice and Mark both made very good points there. Austria was likely to happen, as Mark said, because Dietrich Mateschitz bankrolls the whole thing. But a lot of the money that comes to stage the Italian Grand Prix, and you can all correct me if I'm wrong, comes from the Italian government, and that is on its knees just now. And I was speaking to somebody in Italy a few days ago, and they doubted whether Monza would actually happen. And also, for Silverstone to be happening in July, apparently it takes over 100 medical staff to make Silverstone happen, which seems an awful lot, but it's a very high risk sport. And would anybody actually feel comfortable taking that away from the NHS or any other country's health service at this time? I mean, I think sport is a very uniting thing, and I know the government are desperately keen to get football, for example, back on television because essentially sport keeps people inside. But you've got to imagine the resources that you're pulling away from other key places to make sport happen.
I agree totally about the country being in a powerless condition. But on the other hand, if I could just put one small alternative view, which I read, which I think's got a lot of validity, and that is that because Italy is so much on its knees after having had such a dreadful time, there's nothing could boost the country more than the Italian Grand Prix with Ferrari performing. It's something that would actually work. I know that's a small argument regarding to the overall state of the nation, but it's just a thought, I think, that it is worth something.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very good point you make, Maurice, and this is really why everyone is in such a dilemma, isn't it? I mean, actually, we'd love to see nothing more than sport returning fully for both the mental health benefit that it gives all of society to be entertained and to watch their heroes in whatever sport it is that you happen to be following. And I mean, someone like Lee, who has, unlike us, worked in sports other than Formula One, the enthusiasm that fans have for all sports is, something we've all been able to witness. So I think being able to bring the Italian Grand Prix back certainly would really resonate with fans. But there's such a dilemma in the middle of all of this in terms of the overall benefit of the healthcare system, as Lee said, devoting any resource towards supporting sporting events. So I suspect everything will ultimately come down to what happens in the weeks ahead as hopefully COVID-19 begins to dissipate and some degree of normality return. And who knows where we will be in 6 to 8 weeks' time.
There's a question I have straight away for Maurice then. Given we're talking about Austria, given we're talking about Dietrich Mateschitz, which brings us to another great Austrian, someone you have written a book about, and it's coming out, on May the 14th, about Niki Lauda, the biography. What do you think Niki Lauda would have recommended? Such a positive, can-do person.
Indeed, Jonathan. He was always so pragmatic. I think he would just weigh everything up, as he always did, and just come out with a clear answer, yes or no. He would start with his famous line that he always started something with, it's very simple, and then he would go bang, 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 and you'd go, you know what, you're absolutely right. Now, which way that would be, I don't know. What I do know, Jonathan, is that it would be the common sense answer. He wouldn't be thinking of the Mercedes team, for example, that he works for. He wouldn't be thinking about Austria, his home country. He would simply look at all the pros and cons and say, yep, that's what we should do.
Because the interesting thing, as we mentioned in the last podcast, is that a man who's very close to Niki Lauda, Bernie Ecclestone, has already made clear what he would do. And the two of them were peas in a pod. I mean, the way they worked, you knew straight away, if you got through to Bernie Ecclestone, you'd get a yes or a no. And it was exactly the same with Niki. Yes, no, we do this. He would say, we're going to start in 2021, forget 2020. So we could go round and round. Should we just keep on Niki Lauda? And I'd love to know from you, Lee, when did you first meet Niki Lauda and what was that like?
I first met Niki when I was working in F3000 and GP2 because his son Matthias was racing for one of the Italian teams for Coloni, and his brother Lucas managed Matthias. So, and they are still great friends of mine. And it's the first time I met Niki. I mean, the whole thing was that Matthias was sort of under this shadow of your Niki Lauda's son. And actually at that time in GP2 and F3000 there was, Nelson Piquet Jr. as well. So there was a few people who had grown up in a similar vein. And we were all like, you're your own person and it's absolutely fine and you go out and forge your own career. But when Niki turned up in the paddock, everybody forgot. All of a sudden, Matthias was back to being Niki Lauda's son because everybody was just completely starstruck. That kind of never left me. And I think probably you're not really, I always say to people, don't be a fan, try and have a bit of distance between what you're working on and all the rest of it when I'm speaking at universities and things. But when it came to Niki, I think everybody was a fan because he created this sort of aura and buzz round him, and when he spoke you listened, and it didn't matter if he was telling you the time or what the weather was going to be or what the future of Formula One should be. And from the first day I met him to the last day I saw him, that never changed with me. That always stayed with me. He was just an incredibly magical, or it was just something about him, something around him. Maybe it was the era of racing he came from. Maybe it's how he spoke and told stories and delivered direct answers. You didn't matter if he was telling you your question was rubbish because you were speaking to Niki Lauda. It didn't matter. Yeah, I always remember the first day I met him and I remember the last time I saw him.
Maurice, you met him in a car park, didn't you, in Detroit? And you had to jump to straight away.
Yes, I'd obviously been very aware of who he was. When I went to my first race as a professional writer, it was the South African Grand Prix in 1977, which Niki won. And it turned out to be a substantial win from his personal point of view because, of course, it was the first victory since the big accident at the Nürburgring in 76. So it meant a lot to him. So I was kind of always standing in awe on the sidelines and never really daring to go forward. But the late Alan Henry, a dear friend of mine, and was a very good friend of Niki, they'd sort of grown up together through Formula 2. And I said to Alan, look, I have to do an interview with Niki. I wonder, would you mind introducing me? And we were in Detroit for the 1982 United States Grand Prix in Detroit. And Alan said, yeah, of course. We said, look, meet me in between the practice sessions on the Friday, the 2 free practice sessions. And the pit lane in Detroit was open because the cars were garaged in Cobo Hall, which was some distance away. So the cars are all going to stay and everybody's going to hang around in this open pit lane. And Alan said, a word of warning. He said, if you've got questions and you want to make an appointment for later, but be prepared for him trying to catch you out to see how good you are, because he might well just say, let's do it now. And I said, okay, fine. And what, in the pit lane in Detroit? He said, yeah, could happen. So sure enough, we meet, and Alan takes me forward, and there's busy, you can imagine in the McLaren pit, there's cars everywhere, mechanics going everywhere. Niki's had his debrief with his engineer. He sort of unzipped his overalls, and Alan goes over and there's a little chat with him, and he says, listen, can I introduce you to Maurice Hamilton? He's working for The Guardian, blah, 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 blah. And I said, hello, Niki, very nice to meet you. Look, and I explained what I want to do, and could we have an appointment? And he just said, okay, let's start now, go. And so I luckily had my cassette recorder in my bag. I got that out, I had the questions in my head, and off we went. And he's nodding as I'm asking the question, and clearly I'm passing the test. And then you get all the full answers. But luckily, Alan had warned me otherwise. The other thing, too, on that score was during the course of doing the book, I talked to many, many people who were so helpful and gave me such illuminating thoughts about Niki Lauda. And the journalists I spoke to all had the same experience. All had, their first time they met Niki and were trying to tee up an interview. He'd say, okay, start now. And we all got the same things. So I didn't feel bad about it, and it wasn't just me.
Mark, have you got your story?
To be honest, I can give you the date and the time. 24th of September, 1983, Brands Hatch European Grand Prix. It was about 11:30 in the morning. I'd been working for Autosport magazine for about 3 months, and although I didn't work in Formula One, I had blagged a pass into the pit lane, and I suddenly found myself confronted with Niki Lauda coming out of his garage into the pit lane. And in my bag, I had a copy of his book, For the Record, My Years with Ferrari. So my first ever meeting with Niki involved me going up as a complete fan and saying, Niki, could you possibly autograph my book? And he was, in the heat of battle. He was going to a meeting or something, and he had his overalls on, and he signed my book. I have that copy still on my shelves. And for me, growing up and falling in love with Formula One, really during the Jackie Stewart era, I suppose, and then witnessing, from afar, as all the fans did, what happened to Niki, his fiery accident at the Nürburgring and the comeback and all the rest of it, to actually be in his presence, then for me on that day was something I knew I never would forget.
That doesn't surprise me because I had a long chat with Lucas Lauda, who was fantastic, absolutely wonderful. And Lucas made the point that their dad always said, never ever forget the public, never ever underestimate, never ever be rude, always remember where you've come from. And Lucas said we would be out in Ibiza or somewhere having breakfast. People would come up, we're having our breakfast, and ask to have their picture taken or to have an autograph. And he said, as kids, we just didn't particularly like this intrusion in our privacy with our dad. And Dad always stopped and signed the autograph or had a picture taken, never ever refused. And Lucas said he just drilled that into us. He said, never be rude because these people are so important. And I think, Mark, your story backs that up.
Let's just hear from another motorsport giant who knew Niki very, very well. We all know him. Everyone knows him. He's one of the great treasures of British broadcasting and British sport. This is Murray Walker on Niki Lauda.
He was so much more than just a racing driver, and I don't mean that unkindly. It wasn't just, in quotes, that he won 3 world championships. It was the fact that from the 70s onwards, he was an essential part of Formula One. In the 70s, he was driving for Ferrari with a double world championship. In the 80s, he was a driver for McLaren, and he won the world championship again after a big gap. he started his own airline, would you believe? I mean, you go from a racing driver to starting an airline, Lauda Air, and it was very successful. But then he needed money, and Ron Dennis, who was the boss of McLaren at that time, persuaded Niki Lauda to come back to racing, to drive for McLaren, and he won his third World Championship in 1984. But that wasn't the end of it as far as he was concerned, because where most racing drivers having won 1, 2, let alone 3 World Championships would have stopped, Lauda stayed an essential part of Formula One. He became a consultant for Ferrari. Who better to consult than Niki Lauda? And then he became a team principal for Jaguar. And then, again, he consults with Mercedes, far more than consult, because Niki Lauda was the go-between between the politics of Formula One and the Mercedes, the Daimler-Benz board, and the team. And it's very important to keep them apart. And he took all the flack that was going at that level and let Ross Brawn get on with running the team as it was at that time. And now Toto Wolff is running it, and they were great partners, Toto Wolff and Niki Lauda, both Austrians, and built Mercedes to the level that it's at now, which is virtually unprecedented. Yes, there have been other teams, Lotus, Williams, Ferrari, who have been in dominant positions in the past, but Mercedes has been doing it better, longer than almost any of them. And a lot of that was down to Lauda. And let me emphasise that what a lovely bloke he was, because he had a very, very well-developed sense of humour. And he was everybody's man. You could stop Niki Lauda in the paddock and ask him a question, and you would get a direct answer. In 1974 at Monaco, when he was driving for Ferrari, and that was at a time when you could go up to a driver and ask him if you could talk to him, which you certainly can't now, because you have to go through about 5 layers of public relations people and book up a fortnight in advance. But I went to Niki Lauda in the paddock at Monaco and said, can we do an interview? Yes, he said, yes. I said, when would it suit you? Now? Now? So he sat on the wheel of the Ferrari and I interviewed him. Now? And off we went. I have very fond memories of Niki as a wonderful person, as a fabulous driver, as a very astute politician, as a gigantically clever and talented businessman. Put them all together, and you've got someone who was truly one of the all-time greats, not just in Formula One, but in motorsport and in life.
That's high praise indeed from someone who's met some great characters, not just in Formula One, but in life. Murray Walker talking about Niki, one of the all-time greats, not just in motorsport, in life. What stood out for you, Maurice, when you've talked to all the people you have done, and you've talked to some incredible people, Alain Prost, Lewis Hamilton, Bernie Eccleston, Max Mosley, Jean Alesi, Toto Wolff, you name it. What stood out to you about Niki which made him Niki Lauda?
There was just universal respect, Jonathan. He was not just admired by his colleagues, but respected because of all he'd been through. And that's not just a sympathy vote because of his recovery from the terrible accident in 76. It was because of what he did and the way he did it with such integrity. Nobody had a bad word to say. And I know when you're doing a book, when you're doing a biography and somebody who's passed on, you're not necessarily going to get a bad word, but there genuinely wasn't. There was just so much affection for him right across the board. And a lot of it was just this love of, as we've said and as we'll probably continue to say during this programme, when you asked a question, you got an answer, and it was just so straightforward. You knew exactly where you were. And even if he was having to tell you something that you maybe didn't necessarily want to hear, it would be said in such a nice way and with a twinkle in the eye. It would be very firm. There would be no dancing around, and eyeing. It would bang straight in. This is the way it is. And you go, oh, and you swallow hard. But then you think, yep, he's right. And that was just universal across the board, be it from fellow drivers, be it from journalists, be it from engineers, from Toto Wolff, whoever, they all felt exactly the same. Just this feeling at ease with the man and knowing exactly where you were. I mean, one small example, Mark Surer, I was having lunch with him at Monza, and I just got my tape recorder out and said, listen, Mark, what can you tell me about Niki? And he said, the great thing I remember about him was that when the drivers were having meetings, there was something under debate. And he said, you know what drivers are like, we couldn't agree about anything. And we just turned to Niki, and Niki'd say, okay, this is what we do. Bang, 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 bang. And then we'd all go, yeah, you're right. And he was right. And that says it all.
Maurice, question for you, because you watched him racing for all those years after you came into Formula One yourself as a full-time professional journalist in 77. What kind of a racing driver was Niki Lauda? What can you tell listeners about his style as a driver and the way in which he went about the craft of Formula One racing?
He was completely unremarkable, Mark. I mean, you almost didn't notice him. And that's why I think, when people talk about the greats, the greatest drivers, and you're talking about the pantheon of greats from Juan Manuel Fangio, Jim Clark, right through Ayrton Senna, Michael Schumacher, Lewis Hamilton, whoever, Niki rarely gets mentioned. And that's because he was an unobtrusive driver, in that he would just be in the race and just doing a measured job, winning as slowly as he felt he could, following the Jackie Stewart principle. As a result, he wasn't spectacular. He wasn't the quickest. And he accepted that. In one of the interviews I did, we were talking about that very subject. And he said, no, I knew I was never the fastest. For example, in 84, when Alan Prost suddenly arrived at McLaren. So Niki's had 2 years with John Watson, and he loved John dearly, and they were teammates, of course, before that at Brabham. But Niki knew he had the measure of dear old Watty. Suddenly he said, this little Frenchman arrives, and I know he's younger, and I know he's quicker, and I know I can't beat him. And he tried to out-qualify him in the first couple of races in 84, couldn't, and typical Lauda thought, right, what do? I've got to beat him some other way. I've got to think myself through to the victories. And instead of trying to get fastest lap in qualifying or set the car up for quali, he would work assiduously through 2 days to get the car set up for the race so that it would look after its tyres, it would use less fuel, which was critical at that time, and just run the race according to the way he saw in order to win it. And that's exactly what he did. He said, I made the most of what I had. And that was the key to Lauda, this incredible intelligence that he brought. But it didn't necessarily make for a spectacular driver. You just go past and you go, yeah, it's Niki. And then you'd look at the lap times, and in the days when you were out on track and we didn't have all the computerized screens that we have now, you'd have to wait till you got back to the pits and go and look at Debbie Reese's lap times or something like that to see what was what. And you suddenly see Ian Lauda up near the front, you think, bloody hell, how'd you do that? Where'd that come from? Didn't notice that. And that was typical Niki Lauda.
He was a dream to interview, wasn't he, Lee? Because whenever you went up to him, you knew you were going to get something. I know Maurice said earlier, he was the go-to person, but you always knew that he'd be honest. There was none of this, I'm going to talk to the team, something's not right with the car. No, he'd tell you whether the car was shit or not, and he usually used those words as well. And to use another of his phrases, there's no bullshit, absolutely no bullshit, no bullshit. He was a dream person to talk to, wasn't he?
He was an absolute dream, and he was also incredibly giving, because it didn't matter how close you were to the start of a Grand Prix, you could approach him. And there are some drivers, you give the signal, you wave the mic, and they do a yes or a no. And I'll always give people the option. I'm not someone who likes to charge straight up to somebody, particularly a driver who's about to start a Grand Prix. So I've got a code, I wave a mic. But with Niki, he would always almost bring you over. He was incredibly giving. And what I like about, or what I sort of always admired so much about Niki, is that he wasn't somebody who just sat there saying, Formula One was never as good as my generation. He absolutely loved the time that he was working in, whatever time that was. I think there are so many sort of chippy, disgruntled, not just ex-F1 drivers, but ex-sportsmen. But Niki absolutely embraced everything that he was seeing. Free practice 1, he sat in Mercedes every time and watched FP1, and he might come in 10 minutes late, but he watched more Formula One than quite a lot of people who are on television just now. In fact, I remember being in Mercedes during an FP1, and Bernie knew that he would be there, and Bernie walked in. It was Niki's birthday, and for some reason Bernie thought the gift that Niki needed was a stuffed rat, which wasn't a rat, it looked more like a squirrel, and it was sitting on a remote control quad bike, which then nobody watched FP1 because this thing was going hell for leather round the Mercedes hospitality. But everybody knew where to find Niki. In Brazil, Nelson Piquet would come in and, you know, practical jokes, there'd be things flying through the window. But half the time in Formula One, you're never quite sure where to find people. Not Niki. He was there from the first minute of the first session, and I loved that about him.
And what about his relationship with Lewis Hamilton? Because that was so instrumental, fundamental, really, wasn't it, to how well Mercedes became, how they developed, because those two got it together. Niki was instrumental in bringing him, and then the rest, as we see, is just his title after title after title.
I think just every driver, it doesn't matter who it was, but particularly Lewis, as you say, just respected everything and almost sort of hung on the words of what Niki said. And again, not every ex-F1 driver has that. There's a little bit of a, you know, these people who stand in front of a television microphone and just blurt things out. But Niki wasn't like that, even when he was doing the RTL coverage at the same time, because this is somebody who had a lot of jobs going on simultaneously in Formula One. But yeah, the respect that Lewis had, you know, that was the thing I thought most last year, particularly in Monaco, for example, how not just Toto Wolff and Mercedes would handle it, but actually how Lewis Hamilton and Valtteri would handle it on a race weekend, because this was, you know, the Monday, Tuesday before the Monaco Grand Prix when Niki sadly left us. But, you know, Lewis did what he needed to and got through it, and, you know, then spoke beautifully about him afterwards. The level of respect was huge.
But this is the man, Maurice and Mark, I'm sure you've got a view too, who just knew his mind. He knew when he wanted to get out of Ferrari, and how many people just go, actually, Enzo, I'm going somewhere else, and then turn Bernie Ecclestone down and say, do you know what, I've had enough of this in the middle of the Canadian Grand Prix, I'm going that weekend, then come back. But also was prepared, Maurice, when he was in charge of Lauda Air, to take on Boeing in the aftermath of the Thailand air crash in 1991, 223 passengers and crew killed. And he would not rest until he'd found out the truth. But also, even more remarkably, he was prepared to let people, the relatives of those who died, call him at any hour of the day. That is extraordinary by any executive, not least someone who's a superstar from another sport.
Indeed, Jonathan. I mean, this is a whole story in itself, the business of Lauda Air and that crash. I first became aware of it actually when the significance of it from his point of view, beyond the obvious, was when I was writing for The Observer. They had a series of features called Triumph and Despair, where they spoke to various sports people about the greatest moment of triumph and the greatest moment of despair. And they came to me and they said, listen, can you do a motor racing one? Who do you think? And I said, Niki Lauda. I love talking to him. And it's obvious what it would be, you know, the crash that nearly killed him, and then coming back and winning the World Championship. So Julie went up to see him. Yeah, no problem. Okay, start, and off we went. And yes, it was the Triumph was winning. Is actually winning the championship after that in '77. So I said, the Despair must be the accident itself. He said, no, not at all. He said it was the crash in Thailand, the plane crash. And he then began to explain to me what he'd been through to get to the bottom of this. And it is the most incredible story. As you say, Jonathan, he felt it very deeply. I mean, he was... people, you talk about how caring he was. And this really came out in his story because he cared a lot about the relatives of the dead passengers. And he felt a deep responsibility for all that. And he couldn't... The thing that was annoying him for 8 months until he got admission from Boeing that there had been a fault with the aircraft, that they thought it was his fault, and he couldn't give an answer as to why it had happened, and it was really bugging him and driving him on. And I spoke to the CEO, Otmar Lenz of Lauda Air, about what Niki was like, and he said he was just such a driven man. He said, I know he was a driven man anyway, but this was even more so. He was very upset about what had happened and that he hadn't an answer to give to the people who were ringing him. Sometimes it would be 20 or 30 calls a day. Do you know why? What happened? Can you explain any more? No, he couldn't. And the way he did it, of course, is just a story in itself. In that the sad part, first of all, is that the turning point for Niki came when there was, right at the very end, there was a mass burial in Bangkok for 23 unidentified victims. So he went to that funeral, and all the relatives who had to assume that their loved ones had to be in this mass grave. And he said it was just, the emotion was too much. and they were looking at him for an answer, and he said, I didn't have one, but I had a good idea what the answer was. And that was that he pieced together bits and pieces. Don't forget, he could fly a Boeing 767. He could fly all his aircraft. He suspected that the reverse thrust on one engine had come on at 28,000 feet. The aircraft had inverted and just plummeted earthward. That all the signs were from the cockpit voice recorder that they had told him that. They couldn't find the black box, by the way. The accident was so severe that they couldn't. Can you imagine? They found the black box, but the tapes inside it they couldn't read them. The fire had been that intense in that part of the aircraft. But he suspected it was the reverse thrust. So he went straight from Bangkok to Seattle, to Boeing headquarters in Seattle, and he demanded to get into the simulator, and he wanted to take it up to 28,000 feet and have it set exactly as it was, as far as they could tell, engage reverse thrust in one engine. Boeing had always said, if reverse thrust comes on one engine, then the plane can be saved. And he didn't believe that. And they wouldn't let him in the simulator. So he said, I won't use the exact words, he said, but let me in my blah, blah, blah. It's my crash, my accident, let me in. And they relented. And several times he engaged reverse thrust, couldn't save the aircraft. It simply inverted, flipped over beyond saving. So he came out. And the funny part of a terribly sad story is that he said, okay, do you accept this? And Boeing said, yeah, okay, right. He said, good, can we now issue a press release? And Boeing said, well, no, you see, we need the lawyers to look at this. We've got to get the wording absolutely right. It's liability and all that. You don't realise in America here the laws, blah, blah, blah. It's going to take a couple of months. He said, bullshit. No. He said, I'll tell you what we're going to do. He said, tomorrow I'm going to hold a press conference. And I'm going to say that we're going to take a Boeing 767 up to 28,000 feet. We're going to engage reverse thrust. You will be on board. I will be on board. You will show me that all's well and everything will be good. Goodbye. And he went off, and he said, when I got back to my hotel, they were waiting for me. He said, okay, we'll sign. We'll issue the press release now. And that's how he dealt with it. And that was just the pragmatism of the man, but also his just passion to get to the bottom of this, because he felt it was wrong that 767s were flying around for 8 months, knowing that this could happen again. Unfortunately, it didn't.
Mark, I know you travel the world speaking to people who are absolutely at the top of their game and going into their practices of how they do things. And one thing that always sort of interests me is that I wonder if Niki sort of was as driven as he was because he was in Formula One, or if that's what attracted him to Formula One. Because Formula One does attract certain type of person, but also, as we all know, Formula One does rub off on you. You know, whether it be David Coulthard, a great friend of all of ours, he was involved in a plane crash. You know, he decided to get on a plane 2 days later because what are the chances of it happening again? Jackie Stewart has this same drive now. He is just astonished with the medical world that they've been and sort of sitting around, as he would see it. His wife, Lady Helen, is suffering from dementia, and he has now got a charity to do this because he is so used to a world where if you need a front wing, if you need a part, if your car needs to go faster, you work day and night. It could turn up at the other side of the world 2 days later. So if something's slow on a Friday, it might be faster on a Sunday. And I just wonder if that's a creation of Formula One, or if it's attracted people like-minded to Formula One.
Oh, what a great question, Lee, and I'm not surprised to get a great question from you. You always have a danger when you work in a professional sport, is that after a few years you start to take it for granted and you become a little bit complacent about the people you're meeting and the things that you're seeing and what you're witnessing and what you're hearing, because we get to know the good and the bad about all of the people that we work with in Formula One, and everyone has their flaws as well as their strengths. When you step right back from Formula One, as indeed with any professional sport, you start to realize that actually it generates a set of behaviors which are actually not common in the business world. And so this is when I talk to audiences of business people, the thing that I quickly realize is that a lot of the stuff that we take for granted in Formula One, because it's the way we have to be in Formula One, that is actually not common in other areas of business and in other areas of life. For example, you can stand up and say to people, when Formula One teams set out to build a new car, they typically have about 6 months to do it. And you don't miss a deadline. I mean, you don't have, Mercedes-Benz doesn't put out a press release in February saying we're running 3 months late with the new car. Now, that will happen in industry. It never happens in Formula One. We work to non-negotiable deadlines. You work with the most extraordinary teamwork. Everyone has to contribute, no question. There's no room for cruisers in Formula One. The chief executive of GE, Jack Welch, who passed away a few months ago, he wrote a book in which he said that, potentially 10% of employees can basically be gotten rid of because they really don't do anything. I can promise you there's never been 10% of employees in a Formula One team who don't do a great deal. So I think it is a phenomenal school for people when they get to F1. So whether it's Niki Lauda or David Coulthard or Toto Wolff or anybody else who comes into our sport, when you get to the pinnacle, you have learned those behaviours because of the inherent environment within which Formula One operates, and it then becomes very exportable, because if you then take that same mentality, in Niki's case, he took that approach into the airline business, that can-do approach. We're going to cut through all the wastage. We're going to have an efficient airline. We're going to say what we're going to do. We're going to do what we say. I mean, and again, you mentioned DC. I mean, working with DC, one thing that comes across is, when he puts his mind to something, he really cuts to the chase, and he doesn't like to hang about in terms of, traditional ways of doing business. So I do think, in answer to your question, Formula One really takes already good people and turns them into great people, because in order to win in this business, you just have to have the right behaviours, the right culture, and mindset around it.
Just to say, Niki Lauda, the biography, we could carry on all day, and we've got to hear from another world champion in Formula One. But Niki Lauda, the biography, published the 14th of May, written by Maurice Hamilton. Don't go anywhere yet, Maurice, and likewise Lee. But I'm going to ask you, just as a way into our next guest, as in another Formula One champion, Mika Hakkinen, give me, Maurice, if you can, I need to pace myself here so you're given a chance. What's your best killer Mika Hakkinen story before we hear more from this two-time champion?
I don't know if I can say this one on air, but I'll give it a go anyway, because it's a true story, and it's the one relating to his early days with Ayrton Senna. It was 1993. Michael Andretti had been Ayrton's teammate. Then towards the end of the season, Michael and Mario, his dad, decided perhaps he'd be better off doing something else, and Mika got his chance. And the first race was at Estoril in Portugal. And in qualifying, at Estoril, there was that long, fast right-hander leading onto the pit straight, very tricky corner. And Mika had been very quick through there. And when they looked at the telemetry in one of the debriefs, Ayrton was astounded to find that Mika had been quicker. And Ayrton casually said to Mika, "How did you do that?" And Mika got up from the table, stood up, clutched his privates and said, "Beer, big balls." And Ayrton never spoke to him again, not for the rest of the year. He was outraged, walked out of the room. And I think Mika will admit that that was a bit of a mistake.
Mark, top that one then, because you've got to know him very well, haven't you, Mika Hakkinen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very privileged to work with him professionally, even still, because we both work with Unibet, and we do a podcast several times a year, basically Inside Formula One with Mika Hakkinen. And it's been great. We've rekindled a friendship which started back in the late 1980s when he was part of the Marlborough Driver Academy, and I was working with them at that time. With Mika, once he kind of builds a bit of trust in you and realizes that you're not going to ask him tricky questions, or if you do ask him a tricky question, you promise not to publish it if he gives the wrong answer. But he's actually very insightful. And the thing that you have to remember about Mika, whenever you hear him speak, apart from the fact that obviously English is not even his second language, is the fact that he's actually an intensely shy guy. And he actually talked about that recently with me in an interview. His default is shyness. He's not a naturally outgoing person, and yet once you dig under the surface, you get these great stories. And further to this, here's something that you may not know, and that is that there's a link between Niki Lauda and Mika Hakkinen, which is James Hunt. And I think many people will be familiar with the fact that James and Niki were involved in a rather titanic battle for the World Championship in which James came out on top. But actually, not many people would realise that Mika Hakkinen and James Hunt worked together. James as a mentor and coach for Mika in the early part of his career. And I started off by asking Mika about that relationship.
Yeah, James was definitely a great personality, great guy, and very easy to approach, easy to talk to. Not like other guys. They are very business-minded and very busy. James was the person who always seems to have time to talk. He was talking quite slowly, easy to understand. He was really talking to you like for the friend, trying to look from the racing driver's point of view, how you could be better racing driver. But James, when I saw him very often, I went to see him in his home. He was very often talking to me about communication, how you approach the people, and how you should work with them to get best out of the people. I think my barrier was a bit language. I was quite a shy guy. So I think those elements definitely didn't help me to be a better racing driver out of the car. So James was helping me in that, and he was really chill out guy.
So when you went to his home, was that his house in London?
That was indeed his home in London, and he had a beautiful house. Like I said, he was really, really relaxed, and I had difficulties. I have a certain picture of the Formula One drivers, and the media has given, of course, certain picture of the drivers, the glamour, the champagne, and this and that. And so when I went to his home, and he was in his Bermuda shorts and T-shirt, and looking, he says, "Oh, he's living normal life, and doing normal things." So it was great confidence me to understand that way. Okay, I want to listen to this guy, what he has to say. He don't have to prove, have to show anything. Don't have to take me in his garage to see his beautiful cars. He showed his personality, how he is, what he has to do to become a great racing driver.
And I remember you telling me that he gave you some advice, which was always have fun.
He did every time when I left from his house. And Mika, remember to have fun. And I suppose when James saw me every time when I got there, I was quite serious. I think I was not feeling so comfortable to go there because I had a feeling he's going to criticize me this and that, and because he don't know me, and because I didn't let people to come close to me. But he always said have fun. But fun didn't mean like go to disco and dance on the tables. He was just saying that when you are on a racetrack, look the positive side of the life and enjoy what you do. And because he knew that way the racing is most time losing. So when there is a success and you make something work well, everything out of it, enjoy about it, show that to people.
About 3 weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago, I think you published a video on the Insider social media app, and of course it then linked through to Instagram and Twitter, and it was a video of you in your garage at home, but you were unicycling around the garage. Now this reminded me of something that I had forgotten, and I remember this from your early days in racing. You are a unicyclist. Talk to us about the unicycling and the fact that you're still doing it all these years later.
Yeah, unicycle. It's like a bicycle. Once you learn to cycle it, you never forget. And I actually, when I was a young kid, I think 15 or something like that, I supposed to go to work and act in a circus many years ago because I was doing a unicycle. I used to go to school with that, and it was very different than other youngsters did. I was in a circus school. Practicing over there to have a profession one day from the circus, but luckily I end up in motor racing world.
Mika, did you want to run away with the circus and travel the world that way?
Yeah, my mother had a circus too. But yeah, I mean, that's when I was a young kid, we used to race with the other racing drivers, because when I brought this unicycle to the paddock in a go-karting time, all the other kids started also unicycling. So we used to have races with unicycles. So yeah, I did the film in a garage in my weekend house here in Fayence, which is 1 hour from Monaco. So it was quite a good way of doing exercise also, doing unicycle, because it's really tough to control your balance in in that one. Mark, have you ever tried unicycle?
No, I've never tried it, but I remember you unicycling in the paddock at Vauxhall Lotus or Opel Lotus races in Europe when you were working with the Marlboro World Championship team program. And I remember seeing you unicycling, and I'd never seen anyone unicycle, to be honest, not live. I'd seen it on TV, and I've never tried it. So I think maybe this is something that we will try when maybe I visit you again. We'll have a go at it.
You have time, Mark, to practice it.
You telling me? I'll tell you what. Shall I go and order a unicycle on Amazon today? I might actually go and do that.
It took me exactly 1 week to learn, and every day I was practicing maybe 1 hour, 2 hours. It took me 1 week, so it didn't take too long.
Well, that's I'm going to add that to. I have a very long list of things that I'm going to do during lockdown. I've just started a book project, and I'm making videos for the internet every day. And now I'm going to learn how to unicycle. I think I'm going to do that just for fun, and I'll send you a video, Mika. But I remember you doing that in the paddock. And I'm pretty sure that we did an interview during which I asked you about it. Now, I had forgotten about all of this until I saw your video 2 weeks ago. But I remember you saying to me that unicycling is really good for your balance. Do you think it actually helps you with training your brain as a racing driver?
Oh, definitely. I mean, when you are a racing driver and you want to be a race winner, you want to be a world champion one day, whatever you do in your life, when you open your eyes in the morning, you need to always think about how I can be a better racing driver, how I can win, how I can be better. So whatever I do it because I want to be a better racing driver. So unicycle is definitely a fabulous tool to make your balance better. Of course, it has a lot of physical things which can be positive for you. And again, going back to James Hunt story, it needs to be fun.
So, Mark Gallagher, how is the unicycling? How's it going? Have you fallen off, or even have you started?
Well, I have gone through a very careful selection process on Amazon. I found lots of different models. So you can get a cheapy one for about 40 quid. You can get an expensive professional unicycle for about £300. So I've settled for a kind of intermediate range one, and it's being sent to me this week. And I then have a very short amount of time to learn how to ride this thing before I meet Mika, hopefully when we're allowed to travel again in the summertime. That's if you ever hear from me again, because I could be another unexpected victim of the coronavirus lockdown. I don't get this right.
Mark, I would just say the NHS have got enough on their plate just now without you starting to take up this as a career. I thought it was a wonderful interview to hear Mika speaking so openly. Mark mentioned it, when you have Mika's trust, it is a whole different thing. Mika's got this sort of funny reputation, I think, in the UK, because as he said himself, he didn't really let people get that close to him. And again, working with David Coulthard, who is the exact opposite, he's much more gregarious. And David certainly used that to his use, as I think David talked about in the first episode of your podcast. You know, Mika went off and did the business, and then David actually took it upon himself to go to the sponsors and almost make that his own. But the two of them remain great friends, and we decided to do a feature during BBC Formula One with David and with Mika, and we were a bit nervous about approaching Mika about it because we wanted to do this thing about what do drivers do who aren't actually just talking on television, because a lot of ex-drivers are talking on television. And we put it to Mika, what we'd like to do is cover him with a dust sheet and leave him in a garage as if he'd been there since he stopped racing. And most drivers would look at you just like, what on earth? And Mika just went, this sounds good. Like straight away bought into it. We draped a cover over him and sort of like dusted him off, and then he got in his old car and drove off, and it was wonderful. But when you get that trust like Mark obviously has, he is a very intelligent thinking person. And to hear that link, I didn't know about the link with James Hunt, and it's you suddenly forget sometimes when crossovers happen in the different generations, and I thought that was really lovely to hear.
Maurice, Hamilton, Lee McKenzie, thank you very much indeed. Mark and I will be back again. I'm just going to leave you with some, just to put it all together, with some words from Niki Lauda, who we spent so much time talking about and revering almost, understandably so. I think it's a great quote, particularly for now in the current lockdown and where we are in the world. This is what he said to Alain Prost one time after he'd had a frustrating race, Alain Prost. You can't change things. Tomorrow morning, think about what comes next. Never think back. We'll talk to you again at the controls in June.